Hi, my name is Thomas L. Smith, founder of the Black Ancestry Network Group LLC, the B.A.N.G. And let me be the first to welcome you to the very first B.A.N.G. podcast episode, The Confederate Resurrection, the 25 keys that opened the door to Donald Trump. This series reflects on a summarized version of American history that most African Americans were never taught. I'm part of the first generation to grow up without Jim Crow laws, and I had the privilege of meeting my great-grandmother, a woman who belonged to the first generation to live without seeing slavery. That means the history we're about to unpack isn't ancient. It's personal, it's living, and it's far more recent than many of us realize. I've always believed that those who do not learn from their history are doomed to repeat it. With that in mind, I want to encourage you. Learn the pattern of white supremacy. Study it like a map, because when you can recognize the pattern, you'll see exactly where we are in history and how we got here. So sit back, listen closely, and prepare to connect the dots. Without further ado, I present to you the host of the B.A.N.G. podcast. I give you, Are You Kidding Mia?
Thank you, Mr. Smith. It's a pleasure to be a part of the B.A.N.G. And to you listeners, prepare yourself. This is going to be a very bumpy ride. Everything you are about to hear can be researched and verified. This is going to be a straight line of historical markers that even white Americans will find difficult to swallow. So buckle up. This is going to be a lesson that many of you may have never been taught. So, if you're ready, let's get it! This podcast is entitled The Confederate Resurrection and the 25 Keys that Opened the Door to Donald Trump. The history of the United States is not a straight line of progress. It is a series of cycles, moments of hard-won liberty for some, followed by fierce backlash to reassert racial and class dominance. From land theft to redlining, from slavery to mass incarceration, each generation has crafted new mechanisms to maintain old hierarchies. What began with stolen land and enslaved labor has evolved into policies, propaganda, and policing that continue to disproportionately harm Black, Hispanic, and Indigenous communities. This podcast presents 25 interlocking keys, moments, movements, and mechanisms that explain how we got to Donald J. Trump. These are not isolated events. They are systemic echoes, reverberations across time where racism, profit, and power dance together. These keys expose how racial capitalism shaped land policies, like the Louisiana Purchase and Homestead Act, reveal how white fear and Southern revenge birthed the KKK, Jim Crow, and segregation, show how U.S. foreign and domestic policies, like the war on drugs or mass incarceration, disproportionately punished Black communities, trace how political realignments, like the Southern Strategy and Reaganomics, weaponized white grievance into electoral power, and ultimately demonstrate that Trump did not invent this system. He was created by it. As Confederate monuments fell, his rise was not coincidence. It was consequence. His slogan, "Make America Great Again," is not about economic nostalgia. It's about reclaiming racial control, a dog whistle to erase when whiteness ruled unquestioned. With each point, we are forced to confront a difficult truth. Trump's presidency is not a break in American history. It is its mirror. At the end of this analysis, we ask a chilling question. Who does Donald Trump represent? And who does he hate? We invite you to read these 25 keys carefully. Connect the dots. Trace the bloodlines. See the patterns. Because understanding how we got here is the first step toward breaking the cycle. Key 1. The Nebraska Act. The Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854 opened vast new territories for settlement, but repealed the Missouri Compromise, allowing settlers to decide whether to allow slavery. This inflamed sectional tensions and pushed the nation closer to civil war. Key 2. The Louisiana Purchase. In 1803, the U.S. doubled in size with the Louisiana Purchase from France. It laid the foundation for westward expansion, land conflicts, and debates over the expansion of slavery into new territories. Key 3. The Louisiana Purchase and the westward expansion. In 1803, under President Thomas Jefferson, the United States completed the Louisiana Purchase, acquiring over 828,000 square miles of land from France. This deal doubled the size of the United States, stretching from the Mississippi River to the Rocky Mountains. While hailed as a monumental moment in American history, it marked the beginning of a new phase in the displacement of indigenous peoples and the expansion of racialized land control. With new territory to explore and exploit, the U.S. government promoted westward expansion under the banner of Manifest Destiny, the belief that it was the divine right of white Americans to spread their civilization across the continent. In reality, this destiny meant the forced removal, genocide, and dispossession of Native American tribes, and the expansion of slavery into new Western territories. To secure dominance over the newly acquired lands, the U.S. government deployed military force to remove Native nations, land grants and homesteading programs for white settlers, laws and surveys that formalized racial exclusion and land theft. White settlers moved west with government backing, while Native Americans were pushed into designated Indian territory. Meanwhile, Black Americans, both enslaved and free, were systematically excluded from reaping the benefits of this new land, reinforcing a racial caste system that grew as fast as the nation's borders. In this way, the Louisiana Purchase and westward expansion set the stage for centuries of state-sanctioned racial inequality, rooted in the very soil the nation had acquired. Key 4. Horace Greeley's Prayer of the 20 Millions, 1862. Horace Greeley implored President Lincoln to enforce the Confiscation Acts, which freed slaves of Confederate supporters. Lincoln responded with clarity. His primary objective was to preserve the Union, not immediately abolish slavery. Key 5. Lincoln's paramount objective. During the turbulent years leading up to the Civil War, the American political landscape was undergoing a major transformation. At the center of this shift was the issue of slavery, and President Abraham Lincoln's now famous response to abolitionist Horace Greeley's Prayer of 20 Millions editorial in August 1862. Greeley demanded that Lincoln enforce the Confiscation Acts, which would liberate enslaved people held by rebels. Lincoln replied with a measured and strategic statement, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. What I do about slavery, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union." But this statement came at a time when the political parties themselves were shifting around the slavery question. Political realignments, the collapse of the Whigs and rise of anti-slavery parties. The Whig Party, once a dominant force, began to fracture under the pressure of sectional disputes. Many anti-slavery Whigs broke away, disillusioned by the party's indecision on slavery. These former Whigs joined with members of two radical abolitionist parties, the Free Soil Party and the Liberty Party, to form a new coalition. The Free Soil Party was founded in 1848 with the primary goal of preventing the expansion of slavery into newly acquired Western territories. The Liberty Party, established in 1840, was even more radical, advocating for the immediate abolition of slavery on moral and religious grounds. These groups found common cause with other anti-slavery activists and reformers, ultimately uniting in the 1850s to form the Republican Party, a party whose foundational purpose was to halt the spread of slavery. Lincoln and Douglas, party affiliations with a purpose. Abraham Lincoln, originally a Whig, joined the Republican Party because it aligned with his growing belief that slavery should not expand into new territories. Though not initially an outright abolitionist, Lincoln's political evolution during the Civil War transformed him into a president willing to sign the Emancipation Proclamation and push for the 13th Amendment. Frederick Douglass, the formerly enslaved abolitionist and orator, originally supported the Liberty Party, but eventually aligned with the Republican Party, seeing it as the most viable political vehicle to secure civil rights for African Americans. Douglass spoke at Republican conventions and strongly advocated for Black suffrage and civil rights within the party platform. Key 6. The 13th Amendment of 1861, Corwin Amendment. House Resolution 80, the Corwin Amendment, was passed to appease Southern states by protecting slavery where it already existed. Had it been ratified, slavery would still be constitutional in those states today. Key 7. Reconstruction and the rise of the KKK. Following the Civil War, Reconstruction aimed to rebuild the South and integrate freed slaves. In retaliation, white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan emerged, targeting Black leaders and communities. Key 8. The rise of Black political power. Following the Civil War, the Reconstruction era, 1865-1877, briefly opened the door for unprecedented black political participation in the United States. For the first time, African Americans were elected to public office at local, state, and federal levels. Black men served as senators, U.S. congressmen, state representatives, sheriffs, mayors, city councilmen, and even lieutenant governors and governors in states like Louisiana and South Carolina. Ulysses S. Grant and the fight against the Klan. President Ulysses S. Grant, a former Union general, led a federal crackdown against the Ku Klux Klan, KKK, a white supremacist terrorist organization founded in 1865 in Pulaski, Tennessee. Grant backed the Enforcement Acts, also known as the Ku Klux Klan Acts, of 1870 and 1871, which empowered the federal government to arrest and prosecute Klan members who terrorized black citizens through lynchings, beatings, arson, and voter intimidation. Grant used federal troops and marshals to dismantle Klan strongholds across the South, temporarily breaking their power. The Red Shirts organized white resistance. As the KKK was being suppressed, a new wave of white supremacist paramilitary groups arose, most notably the Red Shirts. Emerging primarily in Mississippi and South Carolina, the Red Shirts wore bright red garments and paraded through black communities to intimidate and terrorize African Americans and white Republicans. Their actions escalated in the 1870s as Reconstruction governments struggled to maintain order. In South Carolina, Red Shirts orchestrated massive voter suppression campaigns, often using deadly force to prevent black citizens from voting. They frequently surrounded polling places, assaulted freedmen, and ran black office holders out of town, all with the goal of restoring white Democratic control of Southern politics. These vigilante groups worked hand in hand with local white elites, former Confederates, and ex-plantation owners to reestablish racial dominance in the post-war South. A coordinated campaign of terror. The Red Shirts and the KKK were two sides of the same coin, one clothed in nightmarish hoods, the other in uniforms of political rebellion. Both groups used assassination, property destruction, kidnappings, and mob violence to destabilize black communities and dismantle the fragile gains made during Reconstruction. Together, they created an environment of racial terror, effectively ending Reconstruction by the late 1870s. Federal withdrawal from the South in 1877, as part of the Compromise of 1877, allowed these groups to reassert white dominance and usher in the era of Jim Crow laws, disenfranchisement, and state-sanctioned racial segregation. Key 9. The KKK as a terrorist organization. After the federal retreat from Reconstruction in 1877, white supremacists unleashed a wave of massacres, lynchings, and organized domestic terrorism designed to eliminate black political power, suppress black voting rights, and reassert white dominance across the South. Massacres as political terror. Numerous massacres occurred during this period, often timed around elections to suppress black votes and restore white democratic control. The Colfax Massacre, 1873, in Louisiana. White militias attacked black freedmen defending a courthouse. Over 150 African Americans were murdered, many after surrendering. The perpetrators were rarely prosecuted. The Hamburg Massacre, 1876, in South Carolina. White Democrats, including militias, attacked a black militia unit. Several were murdered, and the act served as an intimidation campaign to suppress black voters ahead of the state election. The Wilmington Coup, 1898, in North Carolina. Armed white mobs violently overthrew a legally elected majority black local government. Dozens of African Americans were killed, black businesses were burned, and the press was silenced. It was the only successful coup d'etat in U.S. history. The Elaine Massacre, 1919, in Arkansas. After black sharecroppers organized for fair wages, hundreds were slaughtered by white mobs and law enforcement. Estimates of the death toll reach as high as 800 African Americans. These massacres weren't random acts of violence. They were deliberate political strategies to destroy black civil society, suppress black votes, and reestablish white supremacy. Benjamin Pitchfork Tillman, architect of white rule. No figure embodied this strategy more than Benjamin R. Tillman, known infamously as Pitchfork Ben. A South Carolina governor, 1890 to 1894, and U.S. senator, 1895 to 1918, Tillman was a proud white supremacist who openly endorsed lynching, voter suppression, and black disenfranchisement. He led and participated in the Hamburg Massacre of 1876. He advocated for murdering black citizens who tried to vote or assert civil rights. He helped draft and pass the 1895 South Carolina Constitution, which implemented poll taxes, literacy tests, and grandfather clauses that stripped black citizens of their voting rights for nearly a century. Tillman's speeches in the U.S. Senate boasted about keeping the Negro in his place, and he remained unrepentant until his death. He symbolized how white domestic terrorism became institutionalized, merging with Southern politics and becoming the bedrock of Jim Crow laws, the Klan, and local enforcement. Alongside political figures like Tillman, the resurging Ku Klux Klan operated as the paramilitary arm of white supremacy. They lynched, burned churches, terrorized educators, and intimidated entire black communities into silence. Their coordinated violence reinforced the social order that men like Tillman built into law. Key 10. The Exoduster Movement. Terror as a tool of disenfranchisement. Following the Civil War and the passage of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments, formerly enslaved African Americans began to build political power across the South. For a brief time during Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, Black Americans held office at every level of government, including U.S. Congress, state legislatures, and local offices like mayors, sheriffs, and school board members. However, this progress sparked violent backlash. White supremacist groups such as the Ku Klux Klan, the White League, and the Red Shirts used terror, murder, rape, arson, and voter intimidation to dismantle black political power. Black politicians were assassinated or driven from office. Black communities were attacked during election seasons to suppress the vote. Polling places were burned and armed mobs patrolled ballot lines. Federal troops were withdrawn in 1877, leaving black citizens vulnerable. This terror was not random. It was a deliberate campaign of political suppression. By the end of the 19th century, black political representation had nearly vanished from the South, replaced by Jim Crow regimes that enforced segregation and racial subjugation. The Exoduster Movement, escaping terror by heading west. In response to this violence and loss of civil rights, tens of thousands of African Americans became exodusters, fleeing the South in search of safety, land, and freedom in the American West. Led by figures such as Benjamin Pap Singleton, a formerly enslaved man turned abolitionist and land promoter, many African Americans moved to places like Kansas, Oklahoma, and Nebraska in the late 1870s and 1880s. Singleton saw migration as the only solution for escaping racial violence and economic oppression. They formed all-black towns like Nicodemus, Kansas, a beacon of black independence. However, even in the West, racism and land exploitation limited opportunities. White Southerners followed these migrations and brought with them the same systems of control and discrimination, a legacy of forced displacement. The Exoduster movement represents more than just a migration. It was a flight from racial terror, forced by the collapse of federal protection and the rise of white supremacist governance. It also marks a pivotal moment when African Americans took bold action to reclaim their dignity and agency, even in the face of overwhelming odds. Key 11. Southern whites followed the Exodus. The Great Migration and the Black Exodus. Beginning in the early 20th century, African Americans embarked on what became known as the Great Migration, leaving the American South in large numbers to escape Jim Crow laws, racial violence, and economic oppression. Over 6 million African Americans moved between 1910 and 1970, seeking better opportunities in the North, Midwest, and West. They relocated to cities like Chicago, Detroit, Philadelphia, New York, Cleveland, and Los Angeles, where they sought factory jobs, political rights, education, and basic human dignity. But they were not left alone. The shadow of the South followed. The departure of black families did not mark the end of white Southern hostility. In fact, as black progress gained visibility in these new regions, Southern whites and their ideologies migrated, too, sometimes literally, other times ideologically, through national networks, media, and politics. Key examples: KKK expansion. The Ku Klux Klan experienced its largest national resurgence outside the South in the 1920s, especially in the Midwest and Pacific Northwest. In cities like Indianapolis, Detroit, and Denver, the Klan openly marched, held political power, and targeted black citizens, Catholics, Jews, and immigrants. Job competition and race riots. As African Americans settled into industrial cities, racial tensions surged. White residents, many recently transplanted from the South, responded with violence and exclusionary practices, resulting in race riots in East St. Louis 1917, Chicago 1919, Detroit 1943, and Los Angeles, Watts 1965. These incidents were often instigated by white mobs resentful of black employment, housing, or political voice. Redlining and segregation. Local and federal housing policies in northern cities adopted racial segregation models inspired by Southern Jim Crow, resulting in practices like redlining, restrictive covenants, and discriminatory lending. White flight followed once African Americans gained footholds in certain neighborhoods, creating ghettos through design rather than neglect. Southern cultural control in new forms. Southern ideology also followed African Americans in other forms. Policing and surveillance. Law enforcement in northern cities adopted Southern-style brutality against black communities, reinforcing control through over-policing and criminalization. Educational segregation. Schools in the North and West, though not always legally segregated, became functionally segregated through neighborhood zoning, white resistance, and unequal funding. Political sabotage. Black voters who gained influence in northern cities often faced voter suppression tactics adapted from Southern traditions. Even the Voting Rights Act of 1965 could not prevent subtler forms of exclusion elsewhere. An ongoing pattern of pursuit. Wherever African Americans sought refuge, opportunity, and autonomy, Southern white resistance adapted and followed through institutions, laws, and social movements. The pursuit was not limited to geography, but included efforts to limit progress, erase gains, and reassert dominance. This pattern reveals a painful truth. Black progress in America has never been allowed to flourish without confrontation, and often that confrontation came from the same forces they were fleeing. Key 12. Sharecropping, black codes, and Jim Crow. Post-emancipation economic control, sharecropping. After the Civil War and emancipation, white landowners devised sharecropping as a way to maintain economic dominance over formerly enslaved black families. Without access to land, tools, or credit, freedmen were forced into contracts where they rented small plots of land in exchange for a portion of their crop yield, often under exploitative terms. This system kept black families in perpetual debt, ensuring economic dependency and limiting mobility, much like slavery under a new name. Legal shackles. The Black Codes. Southern states swiftly passed Black Codes, laws designed to restrict the freedoms of newly freed African Americans. These laws criminalized unemployment and vagrancy, which only targeted blacks, forced African Americans to sign yearly labor contracts, forbade them from owning firearms, voting, serving on juries, or testifying against whites. These laws laid the groundwork for what would become Jim Crow laws, enabling systemic oppression through state-sanctioned means. Jim Crow codifying racial hierarchy. Named after a minstrel character, Jim Crow laws enforced racial segregation in schools, transportation, restrooms, housing, hospitals, and even cemeteries. They were passed not just in the South, but in many northern and border states as well. These laws aimed to preserve white supremacy politically, socially, and economically, undermine black education, business, and autonomy, keep black citizens disenfranchised and disempowered. Mass incarceration begins, criminalization of black identity. Under the 13th Amendment's clause allowing involuntary servitude as punishment for crime, Southern states began arresting African Americans en masse for minor infractions like loitering, not having proof of employment, or speaking disrespectfully to whites. These prisoners were then leased to corporations and plantations in a system called convict leasing, effectively creating a new form of slave labor through the criminal justice system. This early mass incarceration was not a byproduct, but a designed system to re-enslave black labor and maintain white economic power. Key 13. Disenfranchisement and welfare inequality. The New Deal and the racial wealth divide. When FDR's New Deal introduced programs to assist Americans during the Great Depression, Black Americans were largely excluded from the benefits. Social Security, when first enacted, excluded domestic and agricultural workers, jobs held by over 65% of Black workers in the South. Federal Housing Administration, FHA, loans were denied to Black families or to whites in integrated neighborhoods. Maps were literally redlined, marking Black neighborhoods as high risk. These policies institutionalized the racial wealth gap for generations. GI Bill disparities after War II. After World War II, the GI Bill offered white veterans education, housing, and business opportunities. But Black veterans were often denied loans, turned away from colleges, and refused access to job training. Local banks and VA offices, particularly in the South, enforced segregationist policies, and Northern institutions followed suit in less overt but still discriminatory ways. This created a racial caste of poverty, not by laziness or failure, but by policy design. Welfare programs, used as tools of racial exclusion. Post-war welfare programs were often administered at the state level, enabling white supremacist systems to distribute resources preferentially. Aid to Dependent Children, ADC, was often denied to single Black mothers. Local caseworkers would arbitrarily disqualify Black families based on immorality or perceived disobedience. When affirmative action was introduced to rectify inequalities, backlash emerged, framing such policies as special treatment, ignoring centuries of exclusive white benefit from earlier programs. Key 14, King and X, Two Roads to Equality. Psychological warfare through integration and historical miseducation. The post-Reconstruction shift toward integration in American public education has long been hailed as a victory for civil rights. However, a deeper look reveals a more sinister strategy: the use of integration as a psychological tool to reshape and suppress the historical identity and legacy of African Americans. The B.A.N.G. channel outlines how forced integration, similar to the forced re-education of Native Americans, became a tool for indoctrination, not liberation. Through the integrated school systems, both Black and white students were taught the same history, but that history was carefully curated and filled with half-truths and omissions that served the dominant narrative. The real history of African American agency in the fight for freedom and the preservation of the Union was systematically downplayed or erased. For example, students, both Black and white, were taught that white abolitionists or President Lincoln freed the slaves while ignoring the major role of Black resistance, the United States colored troops, and radical political parties like the Liberty Party and the Free Soil Party. This created a dynamic in which Black students felt gratitude for white saviors, and white students were instilled with a sense of racial pride and superiority. It's a subtle but devastating form of psychological warfare. More specifically, Lincoln himself resisted the full emancipation efforts, even ordering that escaped slaves be returned to their enslavers, in defiance of laws like the Confiscation Act. He was publicly rebuked by men like Horace Greeley and General David Hunter, who acted under congressional authority to emancipate enslaved persons on the battlefield. Videos from the B.A.N.G. channel aim to deprogram this legacy of psychological oppression by highlighting the real emancipators of the Civil War, the USCT, the truth about the 1861 13th Amendment, which sought to protect slavery before the war started, the Free Soil Party and its merger with other anti-slavery movements into the Republican Party, the vital role of the U.S. colored troops, whose participation turned the tide of the war. This reframing reveals that the true goal of integration was not equality, but compliance. By rewriting the historical narrative, the educational system participated in the ongoing deconstruction of Black political power, self-determination, and memory. Integration, then, was not simply about desegregation. It was about control over the story that would shape future generations. And that story was designed to diminish Black autonomy while preserving white dominance. If the false history is believed by both Black and white students, it would create a type of psychological bondage for the Black students and a sense of superiority for white students. The B.A.N.G. Key 15. The Civil Rights Act of 1964. The hidden infrastructure of segregation. The The Civil Rights Act of 1964 is widely remembered as the moment the legal foundation of Jim Crow laws was dismantled. It outlawed segregation in public places and banned employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. But while this was a major victory in the courtroom, a deeper and more insidious structure of racism remained untouched. And that was housing. According to Richard Rothstein's landmark study, The Color of Law. A forgotten history of how our government segregated America. Racial segregation in housing was not just a matter of personal prejudice or market forces. It was systematic federal, state, and local policy. These were not de facto segregations, the result of private choices, but de jure segregations, policies mandated and enforced by law. Government-enforced housing segregation. Rothstein outlines how. The Federal Housing Administration, FHA, explicitly refused to insure mortgages for African Americans or for white families in integrated neighborhoods, a policy known as redlining. Public housing projects, originally intended for integrated use, were deliberately segregated by race, even in northern cities. Suburban developments, like the famed Levittown, were built with FHA backing only under the condition that homes not be sold to black families. Racial covenants in property deeds ensured this policy was maintained privately after federal policies began to be challenged. Civil rights law versus structural racism. The Civil Rights Act had little power to undo these decades of structural racial exclusion. Black families were now legally allowed to eat at the same lunch counters as whites, but were still locked out of the single greatest asset-building mechanism in U.S. history: home ownership. This exclusion created and solidified a massive racial wealth gap. By the 1970s and 1980s, even as de jure segregation faded from sight, its effects were deeply entrenched. Schools remained segregated because neighborhoods remained segregated. African American families paid higher rents for substandard housing. Black communities, already disadvantaged, were systematically disqualified from federally backed generational wealth programs. Separate and unequal, repackaged. Even after the civil rights victories, African Americans found themselves shut out of New Deal programs, excluded from GI Bill housing benefits, targeted by urban renewal programs that displaced entire black communities and destroyed black business districts, what James Baldwin called Negro removal. Rothstein proves that this was not accidental. It was deliberate, documented, and enforceable by law and violence. In effect, the legal end of Jim Crow only masked the continuation of segregation under a new form, one that couldn't be easily challenged in court. Summary. The Civil Rights Act of 1964 ended legal segregation, but the United States government's role in creating and maintaining racial housing segregation was never truly dismantled. Rothstein's work reveals that the racial wealth gap and continued residential segregation are the direct results of federal and local policy, not just social or cultural factors. Jim Crow didn't end. It evolved. Key 16. The Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy and the takeover of the Republican Party. After the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, the Democratic Party, once the political home of white segregationist Southern leaders, began to shift toward a platform supporting civil rights and racial equality. This left many white Southern voters politically displaced and resentful. The Southern Strategy was a deliberate political realignment plan by Republican leaders to absorb these disaffected white voters into the GOP. Political strategist Lee Atwater, a key architect of this strategy, admitted that while the language of racism had to become more coded over time, states' rights, tax cuts, forced buzzing, the underlying intent was still racial. The strategy prioritized appealing to white resentment over integration and civil rights progress. One of the most powerful examples of the strategy in action was Ronald Reagan's 1980 campaign kickoff in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a town infamous for the 1964 murder of 3 civil rights workers, Cheney, Goodman, and Schwerner. There, Reagan declared his support for states' rights, sending a clear signal to Southern white voters. Reagan's use of dog whistle rhetoric and symbolic geography made clear that the Republican Party was now open for business to former Southern Democrats. This marked the final stage of a slow-motion political takeover. The Liberty Party, Free Soil Party, and Whig Party of Lincoln's era once stood for abolition and equality. But by the 1980s, the Republican Party had become the political safe haven for former segregationists. Following their exodus from the Democratic Party, this strategy flipped the map of American politics. The Solid South, once Democratic, became Republican strongholds, not because of economic conservatism alone, but because of a well-crafted appeal to racial resentment. This realignment redefined party identities and restructured American politics around race. Key 17. Mass incarceration. Phase 2. The new Jim Crow. The abolition of slavery was not the end of racial caste in America. It was merely the first transformation of it. According to Michelle Alexander, the criminal justice system has become the primary vehicle for a new form of racialized social control, one that functions strikingly similar to the Jim Crow laws of the 19th and 20th centuries. Where slavery was followed by black codes, convict leasing, and Jim Crow segregation, the so-called colorblind era of today has replaced chains with court dockets and plantations with prisons. This is what Alexander calls the new Jim Crow. And Phase 2 of mass incarceration, from the 1970s through the 2000s, represents the solidification of this racial caste system under the guise of criminal justice. A. From civil rights victories to coded suppression. Following the civil rights victories of the 1950s and 60s, the power structures that benefited from white supremacy did not disappear. They rebranded. As overt racial discrimination became socially and legally unacceptable, new laws, policies, and political strategies emerged that targeted Black Americans without ever mentioning race. Richard Nixon's 1968 Law and Order campaign was the beginning of this coded language. Nixon's advisor, John Ehrlichman, later admitted that the war on drugs was designed to disrupt Black communities and anti-war leftists. Ronald Reagan expanded this strategy by declaring the war on drugs in 1982, a political move, not a response to a surge in drug crime. In fact, drug use was on the decline. Nonetheless, Reagan turned a public health issue into a criminal crisis. According to Michelle Alexander, this was not about drugs, it was about social control, and it was highly effective. The media, police, and courts were weaponized to criminalize Black poverty. B. Disproportionate policing and sentencing. During this phase, African Americans became the primary targets of the drug war. Despite equal drug usage rates, Black Americans were 4 to 10 times more likely to be arrested and sentenced to prison. The 1986 Anti-Drug Abuse Act implemented a 100-to-1 sentencing disparity between crack and powder cocaine. Crack was more common in Black communities. Powder cocaine was common in white and wealthier communities. This sentencing disparity was not corrected until the 2010 Fair Sentencing Act, and still remains unjust. In the new Jim Crow, Alexander reveals that more African American adults are under correctional control today, prison, parole, or probation, than were enslaved in 1850. This is not a broken system. It is a system doing exactly what it was designed to do: exclude, isolate, and control Black lives. C. The cycle of civic death. Mass incarceration in Phase 2 didn't end at the prison gate. Like Jim Crow laws, it imposed lifelong consequences. A felony record results in loss of voting rights, exclusion from public housing, employment discrimination, denial of student aid, and permanent social stigma. As Alexander explains, the formerly incarcerated are relegated to a permanent second-class status, not unlike the way freedmen were relegated after Reconstruction. This process recycles individuals into poverty and incarceration, creating a self-reinforcing system. This system, Alexander argues, is not about rehabilitation or safety, but about racial hierarchy and economic exploitation, ensuring that Black bodies remain a source of cheap labor, voter suppression, and social control. D. Profiting off Black suffering. Another pillar of this phase is the prison industrial complex. Corporations such as Core Civic and GEO Group profit directly from caging humans. State and local governments receive federal funds based on prison population quotas. Prison labor, legalized by the 13th Amendment's exception clause, keeps inmates working for as little as 23 cents an hour, often producing goods for Fortune 500 companies. In short, this system turned mass incarceration into a multi-billion-dollar economy, built on the backs of Black and brown men. E. Historical continuity. slavery by another name. What Alexander shows with unflinching clarity is that mass incarceration is not a deviation from America's past. It is a continuation of it. Slavery, black codes, Jim Crow, and mass incarceration are iterations of the same racial caste system, merely updated for new legal and cultural realities. Each system defined black identity as criminal, justified control through public safety, disenfranchised black citizens from political and economic life. Conclusion: a system by design. Mass incarceration Phase 2 was never about crime. It was about preserving racial hierarchy in the aftermath of the civil rights movement. As Michelle Alexander powerfully argues, we have not ended racial caste in America, we have merely redesigned it. The war on drugs, tough-on-crime rhetoric, sentencing disparities, and carceral policies formed a well-orchestrated structure to replace Jim Crow, one in which millions of Black Americans lost their freedom, their families, and their future. Key 18. Redlining and government-sanctioned segregation, the hidden hand of structural racism. It's a dangerous myth that Black communities simply ended up in impoverished, segregated neighborhoods due to market forces or personal choices. Richard Rothstein's The Color of Law dismantles this narrative, proving beyond dispute that residential segregation in America was not de facto, it was de jure, created and enforced by federal, state, and local governments. This systemic effort to segregate Black people and isolate them in under-resourced neighborhoods laid the groundwork for generational poverty, denied wealth-building opportunities, and sustained racial caste without ever needing shackles or chains. A. The government's role in creating the ghettos. From the 1930s through the 1970s, the federal government used housing policy as a weapon of racial division. The Homeowners Loan Corporation, HOLC, created during the New Deal, developed the infamous residential security maps that labeled Black neighborhoods as hazardous, marked in red, thus giving rise to the term redlining. Banks were instructed not to lend in these areas, no matter the income or credit of Black applicants. At the same time, white suburban neighborhoods received federal subsidies and were deemed safe investments, allowing white families to build generational wealth through homeownership. This was not market discrimination. It was government policy. B. African Americans couldn't own boats, planes, or homes. While white Americans were benefiting from low-interest VA and FHA loans to purchase homes in newly created suburbs like Levittown, Black veterans and working-class families were deliberately excluded. They were denied loans, even when creditworthy, simply because of their race. Even when Black families managed to buy homes in redlined areas, their properties were undervalued, services underprovided, and investment withheld. Rothstein notes that African Americans were locked out of the most powerful engine of wealth creation in U.S. history, post-World War II suburban expansion. So, while it is true that Black Americans didn't own boats or planes, they weren't even allowed to own houses in areas where home value appreciated. See zoning, public housing, and the construction of inequality. The segregation wasn't just financial. It was legal and enforced through violence and policy. Zoning laws banned apartment construction in white areas, but allowed industry, railroads, and polluting factories to encroach on Black neighborhoods. Public housing, initially integrated under the New Deal, was later segregated by law, forcing Black residents into vertical ghettos, while white public housing tenants were moved to suburban units. Police forces, real estate boards, and local politicians enforced this divide, sometimes literally through violence and threats. Even urban renewal projects often meant Negro removal, bulldozing Black neighborhoods in the name of progress, and displacing thousands into overcrowded slums. D. The lasting impact. Generational theft. This form of legalized housing apartheid has had devastating consequences. The median white household today has 8-10 times the wealth of the median Black household, largely due to home equity inherited across generations. Black communities, denied access to appreciating assets, remain trapped in areas with underfunded schools, over-policing, and decaying infrastructure. This wasn't accidental. Rothstein emphasizes that it was the result of deliberate government action, rooted in white supremacy and sustained through bipartisan neglect. E. Red shirts, redlining, and structural control. Just as the red shirts terrorized Black voters during Reconstruction, driving them out of towns and intimidating them from political participation. Redlining drove black families out of the economic landscape. Both systems were designed to maintain white dominance. One used mob violence and shotguns, the other used pens, maps, and federal law. The KKK burned crosses. The FHA drew red lines. The result was the same: social, political, and economic exclusion. Conclusion: redlining was not a flaw, it was the system. Rothstein's The Color of Law proves that housing segregation and the crushing poverty it produced wasn't an accident or private failing. It was a state-sponsored system of racial apartheid hidden in plain sight, and its effects echo to this day. The poorest black communities weren't neglected. They were designed. Denied access to boats, planes, or even the suburbs, African Americans were caged into neighborhoods where opportunity could not reach them. And like slavery, convict leasing, and Jim Crow, this segregation was not only intentional, it was constitutionalized. Key 19. The war on drugs, from foreign battlefronts to black neighborhoods. The war on drugs, presented as a crusade to end the flow of narcotics into American communities, quickly became a war on black neighborhoods, despite the fact that hard drugs, particularly cocaine, had not yet become a widespread issue in these communities prior to the late 1980s. Cocaine was a rich man's drug. In the early 1980s, cocaine was predominantly associated with the wealthy and elite, both black and white. It was glamorized in Hollywood, trafficked in high society circles, and rarely found in the poorest communities. It wasn't cheap, it wasn't accessible, and it wasn't commonly used in the inner city. Enter Panama, the Noriega connection. That changed following the U.S. government's military and intelligence operations targeting General Manuel Noriega of Panama, who had been both a CIA asset and a key player in Latin American drug trafficking. When Noriega fell out of favor with U.S. intelligence, the public-facing reason for the 1989 invasion of Panama was framed as a crackdown on the drug trade. However, after Noriega's removal, something strange occurred. Cocaine began flowing into the United States with far greater ease, and began showing up in large quantities in impoverished black communities. Many researchers and journalists have asked, how did a drug once reserved for the wealthy suddenly saturate neighborhoods that couldn't afford it? C. The Hubble hypocrisy. The same year the U.S. launched the war on drugs against Noriega, the U.S. also celebrated the launch of the Hubble Space Telescope, 1990, a marvel of modern science that claimed the power to see millions, even billions of miles away into deep space. And yet, somehow, massive drug shipments were entering Florida, just miles off the U.S. coastline, undetected. Boats, small aircraft, and low-level trafficking operations successfully flooded America's poorest cities with cocaine and later crack. This contradiction struck many observers as either incompetence or complicity. How could America see into the edges of the cosmos, yet fail to detect boats bringing narcotics into Miami? The answer for many is uncomfortable. They weren't failing. They were targeting. D. Targeted enforcement and racial disparity. Once the drugs were in, so was the enforcement. Crack cocaine, primarily used in poor black neighborhoods, was punished 100 times more harshly than powder cocaine used in wealthier, white communities. The Anti-Drug Abuse Act of 1986 and 1988 introduced mandatory minimums disproportionately affecting African Americans. Policing in black communities increased dramatically with militarized tactics and zero-tolerance laws leading to mass incarceration. See point 17. This system did not punish wealth-driven drug use, but rather used drug policy as a tool of racial control, echoing earlier mechanisms like black codes and vagrancy laws. Conclusion. Not a war on drugs, a war on communities. The war on drugs did not create the drug problem. It created the policing justification. The timing of events. Panama, the fall of Noriega, the explosion of crack in black communities, and the launching of satellites capable of mapping galaxies makes one thing clear. This was not a failure of surveillance. It was a successful strategy. By the time public attention turned to the devastation in places like South Central LA, Baltimore, and Detroit, the narrative had already been shaped. These were criminal zones, not victims of geopolitical fallout. And this legacy continues to impact black families today, in incarceration rates, broken homes, and neighborhoods still trying to recover. 20. Clinton's crime bill, the build-up to mass incarceration, Phase 3. In the 1990s, as America grappled with the fallout of the crack epidemic, rising public fear of super predators, and decades of targeted drug policies, the Clinton administration enacted legislation that would become one of the most damaging criminal justice expansions in U.S. history, particularly for African American communities. This era did not invent systemic racism in criminal justice. Instead, it cemented and expanded it, ushering in what scholars and activists now refer to as mass incarceration, Phase 3. A. The 1994 Crime Bill, a watershed moment. Signed into law by President Bill Clinton, the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994 was the largest crime bill in American history. Crafted with bipartisan support and championed by then-Senator Joe Biden, the bill included $9.7 billion for prisons, $8.8 billion for police hiring and training, including funding for 100,000 new officers. The federal Three Strikes Law, which mandated life sentences for individuals convicted of a violent felony after 2 or more prior convictions, including drug crimes. An expansion of the death penalty to over 60 federal crimes. Funding for truth in sentencing laws, which rewarded states for making inmates serve at least 85% of their sentences. While these policies were framed as solutions to rising violent crime, they disproportionately targeted Black and brown communities, intensifying the surveillance, arrest, and incarceration of people who had already suffered under the war on drugs. B. The super predator myth and the demonization of Black youth. In the lead-up to the 1994 bill, political rhetoric stoked fear about a coming wave of super predators, young, often Black males described as remorseless and violent. Hillary Clinton herself invoked this term while advocating for tougher crime laws. This narrative was never grounded in evidence, yet it justified the criminalization of entire generations of Black youth, particularly those living in underfunded, over-policed neighborhoods. C. Welfare reform in the carceral state. The Clinton administration also enacted welfare reforms through the 1996 Personal Responsibility and Work Opportunity Reconciliation Act, which cut benefits for poor families, mostly affecting Black women and children, penalized felons by barring them from receiving housing or food assistance, made it easier to classify poor people as criminals instead of individuals needing support. This simultaneous shrinking of the safety net and expansion of carceral funding left Black families exposed on all sides, economically destabilized, yet criminally targeted. D. The numbers speak for themselves. By the end of the 1990s, the U.S. had added over 500,000 new inmates to the prison population. Black men were incarcerated at 6 to 8 times the rate of white men. Despite similar rates of drug use, families were torn apart, with entire generations of fathers, brothers, and sons removed from communities. E. The result. Mass incarceration Phase 3. If Phase 1 began post-Reconstruction with vagrancy laws and convict leasing, if Phase 2 arose from Nixon's and Reagan's war on drugs, then Phase 3 found its full institutional power in Clinton's tough-on-crime era. Michelle Alexander in The New Jim Crow confirms that this was not merely crime prevention. It was the construction of a new racial caste system built on the ashes of slavery and segregation. The prison system became the new mechanism for racial control, legal, profitable, and devastating. F. Conclusion. Crime or control? President Clinton later admitted that the bill went too far. But for Black America, the damage had been done. Entire communities were now embedded in a system that punished poverty, criminalized addiction, and ignored the structural causes of crime. This was not about crime. It was about control. Phase 3 completed a cycle that began not with crime, but with fear, policy, and profit, and its legacy is still with us today. Key 21, Mass Incarceration, Phase 3, the entrenchment and expansion of the carceral state. Phase 3 of mass incarceration represents the period when the carceral system became fully institutionalized and normalized in American society. No longer an exceptional policy for tough on crime, but a central instrument of governance, social control, and racial stratification. A. Explosive growth in incarceration rates. Prior to the 1970s, the U.S. incarceration rate was relatively stable, approximating 100 per 100,000 Americans. After 1970, the rate grew dramatically. By 2000, the prison population had multiplied several times over. By 2018, incarceration reached 655 persons per 100,000 in prison and jail systems, state and local. Even though some decline has occurred since the 2000s, the U.S. continues to incarcerate more people per capita than virtually any other developed nation. In 2010, for example, the incarceration rate of Black Americans was 2,306 per 100,000 compared to 450 per 100,000 for whites. These dramatic increases were not solely reflective of rising crime. They outpaced crime trends, suggesting systemic drivers beyond public safety. B. Racial disparity and caste logic. Michelle Alexander's The New Jim Crow argues that mass incarceration functions as a racial caste system in disguise. Some key patterns she highlights. Criminal justice policies are written in race-neutral language, but in practice disproportionately target Black and Latino communities. Once labeled a felon, individuals face lifelong legal and social disabilities, inability to vote, difficulty securing employment, denial of housing, education, and public benefits, even after serving sentence. Alexander shows how the system mirrors Jim Crow in its effect. Continuous exclusion, segregation, and dehumanization. Thus, Phase 3 is not only about numbers, it's about immobilizing a population, removing citizenship rights, and dividing society along racial lines under the veneer of crime control. See institutional and legislative drivers. Several policies and institutions made Phase 3 possible. The 1994 Crime Bill and related legislation refined sentencing regimes, mandatory minimums, truth in sentencing laws, and expanded funding for prisons. 3 strikes rules. Offenders with prior convictions often faced life sentences, even for nonviolent crimes. Privatization. Private prison corporations like CoreCivic and GO Group became financial stakeholders in incarceration, creating profit incentives for greater prison populations. Parole and probation reform. Many states curtailed parole release, redesigning supervision to be more punitive, thus increasing reentry incarceration. Collateral consequences. Laws that strip rights from convicted persons, voting bans, welfare bans, denial of housing, student aid, institutionalized a permanent second-class status for many. These structural changes transformed incarceration from an emergency tool into a stable pillar of governance. D. Comparative and global context. The U.S. holds 20% of the world's incarcerated population, despite having 5% of the world's population. Many peer nations incarcerate far fewer people per capita. The U.S. remains an outlier in the developed world. The cost is enormous, billions annually in corrections budgets, plus associated indirect economic and social costs. E. Outcomes. Entrenchment, stigma, and social fracture. Entire Black and brown neighborhoods bear the consequences: skewed gender ratios, increased poverty, trauma, broken families, intergenerational incarceration cycles. Legal invisibility. Once released, many are permanently stigmatized and structurally barred from full citizenship. Political control, mass incarceration suppresses voting and civic participation in communities already marginalized. F. The bridge from Phase 2 to Phase 3. Phase 3 did not emerge in a vacuum. It is the logical extension of Phase 2, war on drugs, racialized policing. What changed was scale, permanence, saturation, and integration into the everyday machinery of law. The penalties became more draconian, the enforcement more aggressive, and the disqualifications more total. Key 22. Confederate symbols and renewed racism, a match made in hell. I. The fall of Confederate monuments, a reckoning long overdue. The removal of Confederate monuments across the U.S. accelerated after the 2015 white supremacist massacre at Mother Emanuel AME Church in Charleston, SC. When Dylan Roof posed with Confederate flags and symbols before murdering 9 Black worshipers, it became undeniable that these symbols were not about heritage. They were about racial terror. The lost cause mythology was embedded in these monuments, many erected between 1890 to 1920 during the rise of Jim Crow, and again in the 1950s-60s during the Civil Rights Movement. According to the Southern Poverty Law Center, over 1,700 Confederate symbols still stood in public places as of 2020. SPLC, whose heritage? The push to remove these was not an erasure of history, but a rejection of white supremacy's veneration as public memory. 2. The rise of Donald J. Trump, a reactionary flame ignited. As statues fell, Trump rose. His 2016 campaign was predicated on white grievance, cultural nostalgia, and implicit racial signaling. Make America Great Again. When white nationalists marched in Charlottesville 2017 chanting, "Jews will not replace us!" and defending a Confederate monument, Donald Trump notoriously responded, "You also had people that were very fine people on both sides." This remark was widely condemned, even by members of his own party, and signaled a false moral equivalence between anti-racist protesters and white supremacists. Trump's words were not a gaffe. They were a political calculation to court the very base that felt embattled by changing demographics, racial justice protests, and yes, the removal of Confederate symbols. 3. A match made in hell. Monuments down, Trump up. It is no coincidence that the backlash to Confederate statue removals became fuel for the Trump movement. Many supporters framed these removals as cancel culture or attacks on American identity. Trump signed an executive order to protect statues, threatening 10-year prison sentences for defacing federal monuments. He called those who tore down monuments anarchists and terrorists, while remaining silent or even supportive of white nationalist rhetoric. The fall of Confederate monuments and the rise of Trump were not independent historical currents. They were twin reactions to the slow unraveling of white hegemony in the U.S. For echoes of the past, Trump and the Confederacy's legacy. Just as the Confederacy attempted to preserve white supremacy through war, Trump has leveraged nostalgia for an imagined racially segregated past, attacked multiracial democracy by calling elections stolen and promoting policies that disproportionately harm black voters, been openly endorsed by the modern-day Ku Klux Klan. David Duke called Trump a candidate aligned with our values. Source, thus, the imagery and ideology of the Old South were not buried with the statues. They were resurrected in the political persona of Donald J. Trump. V. Conclusion. Statues fall, but racism reinvents itself. In summary, the fall of Confederate monuments symbolized a national attempt to reckon with America's racist past. The rise of Donald Trump and his platform of racial grievance and historical denialism symbolized the counter-reaction to that reckoning. Key 23. The rise, fall, and re-rise of Donald Trump, heir to the Southern strategy and echoes of his German grandfather. Donald J. Trump is not merely a political anomaly. He is the culmination of two historical forces: the strategic manipulation of racial resentment through the Southern strategy, and a familial legacy shaped by displacement, exclusion, and belonging, embodied in his grandfather, Friedrich Fritz Trump. The Southern strategy, from segregation to coded nationalism. After the Civil Rights Movement dismantled legal segregation, conservative strategists, most notably under Nixon and later Ronald Reagan, implemented a new plan: win the South by appealing to white resentment. This shift transformed the Republican Party. Ronald Reagan sealed the realignment by launching his 1980 campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi, a town infamous for the murder of 3 civil rights workers, where he declared support for states' rights, a well-known segregationist code phrase. The party, once the home of Lincoln, was now repositioned as the vehicle for Southern white grievance, repackaged in terms like law and order, welfare queens, and the silent majority. By the 2000s, this strategy had fully matured, creating a Republican base rooted in racial resentment, cultural nostalgia, and anti-government rhetoric. Donald Trump inherited this base and reactivated its most overt racial and nationalist impulses. Trump, the Southern strategy's final form. Trump's 2016 campaign brought the Southern strategy full circle. His Make America Great Again slogan signaled a longing for a pre-civil rights, pre-diversity era. His birther movement questioned the legitimacy of the nation's first black president. He received public support from white supremacist groups, including former KKK leader David Duke, who called Trump's campaign a real opportunity for white nationalism. His immigration bans, calls for mass deportations, and language about infested cities echoed George Wallace-era segregationist rhetoric, just updated with 21st century targets like immigrants and Muslims. Trump's political persona became a megaphone for the Southern strategy's endgame. a resegregated America, not by law, but by ideology. Friedrich Trump, displacement, exile, and identity conflict. Trump's political identity mirrors, in many ways, the life story of his grandfather, Friedrich. In 1885, Friedrich Trump emigrated from Bavaria to the U.S., likely to avoid military service. Years later, he attempted to return to Germany with his wife and daughter. But the Bavarian government banished him, citing his illegal departure and failure to serve. His appeal for citizenship reinstatement was denied by Prince Regent Luitpold, despite a desperate letter pleading for mercy. Thus, Friedrich was both a man without a homeland and an immigrant chasing opportunity. Ironically, traits his grandson would later vilify in others. The paradox: Trump as gatekeeper of belonging. Despite this personal family history, Donald Trump's rhetoric has centered on exclusion, purity, and fear of the foreigner. In speeches from 2023-2024, he claimed undocumented immigrants were poisoning the blood of our country, language disturbingly similar to eugenic and fascist ideologies of the past. His calls for mass deportation camps, a nationwide stop-and-frisk policy, and proposals to deny citizenship to U.S.-born children of immigrants mark the most extreme nationalist policies since World War II. This hardline stance stands in ironic tension with his own family's precarious immigrant past, a family that was once rejected for being foreign, stateless, and suspect. Donald Trump, the political heir of the Klan. What makes Trump's alignment with white supremacist groups especially dangerous is the fact that he is the modern recipient of the very forces that once sought to resist black civil rights through terror. The KKK, once the militant wing of the post-Reconstruction Southern Democrats, has publicly supported Trump. He refused to disavow white nationalist groups on multiple occasions, including during the 2016 and 2020 debates. His presidency saw a dramatic surge in hate crimes, militia activity, and far-right violence. In essence, Trump is not an aberration. He is the inevitable product of the Southern strategy's evolution from dog whistles to bullhorns, a Republican Party transformed from the party of Lincoln to the party of white grievance, a personal history of exile, rejection, and identity tension, ironically weaponized into nationalist exclusion. The man whose grandfather was banished from Germany now seeks to banish others from the American dream. And in doing so, he completes both a political strategy and a familial cycle, rising to power by enforcing the very exclusions his own family once fled. Key 24. Donald J. Trump, the culmination of a 150-year backlash, a historical pattern of backlash and resistance. From the Civil War's aftermath to Reconstruction, from the Jim Crow era to the Civil Rights Movement, and from the war on drugs to mass incarceration, a persistent pattern has defined the American racial and political landscape. Black progress has always been met with white backlash. Each of the first 23 points captures a link in that chain. Points 1-5 traced how African Americans fought for freedom, land, and political power after emancipation, only to be betrayed by broken promises and violently suppressed through massacres, forced migration, and legislative sabotage. Points 6-10 showed how terror carried out by the KKK, red shirts, and political machinery was used to erase black political gains and instill long-term fear. Points 11-14 highlighted how Southern whites, unable to preserve slavery, followed black communities north, enforcing a new racial caste system through economic exclusion and state-sponsored discrimination. Points 15-18 illustrated the systemic infrastructure, redlining, housing segregation, black codes, and policy bias that kept African Americans poor and criminalized despite legal victories. Points 19-21 showed how mass incarceration was industrialized through Republican and Democratic administrations alike, weaponizing poverty, drugs, and race to fill prisons and empty communities. Point 22 revealed that as America began symbolically removing racist statues, a cultural panic ensued, a vacuum that Donald Trump rushed to fill. Point 23 tied Trump's rise to his grandfather's legacy and white nationalist sympathies, emphasizing that Trump's presidency is not an anomaly, but rather the natural byproduct of a system built to resist racial justice. Donald Trump as a product and a catalyst. Donald Trump didn't invent racism, economic exclusion, or political violence, but he perfectly embodies them. He is the modern heir of the Southern strategy, taking over the Republican Party by appealing to aggrieved white voters, just as Nixon and Reagan did before him. He is the face of reactionary grievance politics, rising to power not despite, but because of growing black and brown political power. He is endorsed by the same hate groups like the KKK and white nationalist organizations that once wore hoods instead of suits and ties. He defends Confederate symbols while attacking black athletes, immigrants, and civil rights leaders. He governs with the same logic that led to black voter suppression, redlining, mass incarceration, and the dismantling of public welfare, all under the guise of law and order. The final question: who does Donald Trump represent? So after tracing the roots of 23 distinct yet interconnected moments in black history and American politics, we are left with one unavoidable question. Who does Donald Trump represent, and who does he despise? If you follow the policies, the rhetoric, and the consequences, it becomes clear. He represents the Confederacy reborn in modern dress, corporate-funded, socially polished, but ideologically unchanged. He serves those who felt threatened by Reconstruction, who hated the Civil Rights Act, who feared integration, and who today feel displaced by rising diversity. And he despises those who expose this history, those who resist, and those who dare to dream of an America that delivers on its promise for all, especially African Americans. Donald Trump is not simply the 45th president. He is the embodiment of a multi-generational response to black advancement, a culmination of centuries of backlash, and a warning of how history repeats unless we intervene. Key 25, Project 2025 and the Return of the Confederacy. The 25th point is a warning, not just of what has been, but of what is to come. Project 2025, backed by organizations like the Heritage Foundation and supported by Trump-aligned conservatives, aims to reshape the federal government into a tool of authoritarian control. Its blueprint includes eliminating independent federal agencies, purging civil servants and replacing them with loyalists, undoing civil rights protections, rewriting history in school curricula, reestablishing patriarchal control over women's rights and minority protections, silencing dissent under the banner of Christian nationalism. This is not just policy, it is prophecy. It is the final phase of a long, unbroken cycle of backlash. If the Civil War was the fight to end slavery, if Reconstruction was the fight to build equality, if Jim Crow was the retaliation to destroy progress, if the Civil Rights era was a second wind of hope, then Project 2025 is the Confederate Dream reborn. It seeks not just to rewind progress, but to obliterate the very foundation of multiracial democracy. Point 25 concludes with this stark reality. We are no longer theorizing. The blueprint has been written. The appointments are being made. The next Confederacy may not wear gray uniforms, but it will speak from pulpits, control courtrooms, and rewrite the Constitution in real time.
Mr. Smith here. Before you go, if you would like more podcasts like this one available at youtube.com/@thebang, let me know in the comment area if you have any questions or insights. Feel free to use the comment section. I'll do my best to read them all. You know what comes next? Like and subscribe for more, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you don't miss out on anything. The next Bang podcast I will share with you is True Biblical Chronology According to the Book of Jubilees. The next podcast will allow you to see the Bible like you have never seen it before. In it, I will prove that Israel sojourned in Egypt for 243 years, and not 430 years as is commonly believed. Which begs to question the biblical interpretation of Genesis 12:40-41. Now the sojourning of the children of Israel who dwelt in Egypt was 430 years. And it came to pass at the end of the 430 years, even the selfsame day it came to pass, that all the hosts of the Lord went out from the land of Egypt. However, biblical genealogy does not support this chronological count of time, and I can prove it. Until then, shalom, and may the Most High God of Israel be with you. Well, until then, this Bang content will end in 3, 2, 1.